Hello guys, how's it going? Welcome to my brand new channel where I go into all the details of a true crime case while doing my makeup. Just before we do get into the video, I feel I should give a quick content warning that we are going to be going into some pretty dark topics in today's video, such as murder and sexual assault. So if you are at all unsure about this video or feel like it might affect you in any way, please do feel free to click off this video and go and watch something else. I'd also like to give a quick little disclaimer that all the information that I've compiled in this video has been sourced from the internet, news reports and family statements. And although I research each case as thoroughly as I can before each video, and of course it is never my intention to spread misinformation or cause offence to anybody involved, please do let me know down below in the comments if you see any false information. So with that, let's get right into the case. So this case actually hits very close to home for me because this crime took place in my hometown of Bath. Bath is a small heritage city in the southwest of England in a county called Somerset, and it's most well known for its ancient Roman baths, which attract thousands and thousands of tourists every year. It has a population of about 88,000 people, and everybody who's from Bath knows that it's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else. So with that being said, I am sure that in June of 1984, when this crime was committed, it would have shaken the people of Bath to their core. Melanie Road was born in 1967 to her parents Jean and Tony Road. Tony's job meant that the family had to move around a lot while Melanie was growing up, which is something that her mother worried about for Melanie a lot, because it's something that's often quite difficult for young kids growing up, but Melanie actually adapted to it really well. She never struggled to make friends, and everybody just said that she could walk into a room and just make herself at home immediately. She was deputy head girl of her school, which was Bath High School, and she'd actually been moved up a year, which is something that doesn't really happen very often in the UK. She got straight A results in her first public exams, which were her GCSEs, and she was also on the school hockey team, so you can kind of tell what type of a person Melanie was. One thing that was also said about Melanie a lot was that she loved to bake, and that's actually how she made most of her friends. She used to bake cakes and sort of baked goods at home and then bring them into school and offer them round to her friends. She also adored music and dreamt of going to university to study archaeology. Just everybody who knew her said that she was the most lovely, warm person. She had this amazing smile, and just she was the type of person that radiated kindness. She was the youngest of 3 siblings. She had an older brother called Adrian and also an older sister called Karen. At the time of this case, both Karen and Adrian were in their early 20s and were living away from home, but Melanie, who was only 17 at the time, still lived with her parents, who lived in their house on the suburbs of Bath. On June the 8th, 1984, 1 week before Melanie was due to take her A-levels, which if you're from the US, they're basically the exams that you take just before you leave school in the UK, Tony Road, Melanie's father, drove Melanie to the Francis Hotel in the centre of Bath. Jean Road and Karen, Melanie's sister, were also in the car, and Karen was actually holding her newborn baby as the two of them had come down to visit the family in Bath from Karen's home in the Midlands. On that day, Melanie was said to be in a very happy, positive mood. She was just about to go and meet her friends and spend a fun evening with them. And as the family pulled up outside the Francis Hotel, there was actually a red carpet laid out on the ground in front of the hotel. And as Melanie got out of the car, she turned back to her family and said, "Look, they've laid out a red carpet for me. What a way to go." And little did the family know that these were actually the last words that they would ever hear Melanie say. After getting out of the car, Melanie went to go and meet a friend to play tennis and also bought her mum a bouquet of flowers. So if this doesn't tell you what kind of a person Melanie was, then I don't really know what will. After the two had finished their game of tennis, Melanie actually went back home very briefly to change. She didn't live very far from the centre of Bath at all, so I'm guessing she just walked. And once she'd changed, she walked back into the centre of Bath. When Melanie returned to the centre of Bath, she went and met up with her friends and also her boyfriend, and they went to the Bonash nightclub, which is in Kingston Parade, which is just next to the very historic Bath Abbey. Melanie had a great time at the club, laughing and partying with her friends and her boyfriend, who she'd been with for a couple of months, and her boyfriend's brother was actually with them as well. Her boyfriend was Greek, and her boyfriend's brother had actually come to England to visit them, so he'd gone out with Melanie and her friends too. At 2 a.m. on the 9th of June, the club actually closed and the group left and all went their separate ways. Melanie's boyfriend actually offered to call Melanie a taxi to send her home, but since Melanie only lived a very little way outside of town, it was about a 15-minute walk, and also it was summertime and she just knew the route very, very well, she decided to walk. Now bear in mind this was 1984 and many girls around Melanie's age at that time would have been more than happy to walk even at night on their own. Not to mention Bath is actually considered to be one of the safest cities in the UK. It has very, very little violent crime, so this would have not been unusual for Melanie or anybody really Melanie's age. So after waving goodbye to her friends and kissing her boyfriend goodbye, Melanie started her 15-minute walk home. But little did she know that she would never make it. She walked through the centre of town up one of the main streets called Broad Street towards the Lansdowne area of Bath where she lived. When Melanie left the club in the centre of town, the streets were still bustling with people who had been to the clubs, who had been out. But as she left the centre of town, more towards the outskirts, the streets got more and more quiet. The last reported sighting of Melanie Road was at 2 a.m. We fast forward now to 5:30 that morning, around 3 hours after Melanie was last seen, when a mailman and his 11-year-old son were doing their rounds, and they discovered the battered body of Melanie Road. After finding Melanie's body, the mailman immediately called the police. One of the parts that I find saddest about this case is that Melanie was actually found lying on her back by some garages around 200 metres from her home. So if she had literally just got a tiny bit further on her journey, she would have been safe. Melanie had been stabbed 26 times, including 8 of those stab wounds being in her breasts. So this was clearly a very frenzied, very angry attack. And not only that, but Melanie had also been sexually assaulted twice by her killer. Everybody who saw Melanie's body said that she looked very stiff, almost mannequin-like, but they did say that she did look very peaceful. She almost looked like she could have been sleeping. Police found a wooden keyring on a nearby wall with the name Melanie printed on it, as well as an eyeliner pencil. But apart from these 2 pieces of evidence, they didn't really have any other way to identify who this woman was. Melanie didn't have a wallet or anything like that on her, and obviously this was 1984, so she wasn't carrying a cell phone. In order to try and get in contact with somebody who knew who this woman was, the police decided to drive around in a police car with a loudspeaker and call out the name Melanie over and over. Now, meanwhile, Jean and Tony Road, Melanie's parents, had slept peacefully through the night, and only when they woke up did they realise that Melanie hadn't slept in her bed. They assumed that she had just slept over at a friend's house, as she often did. Melanie did go out relatively frequently and often stayed at a friend's house overnight, so this didn't massively concern her parents. But what did concern them was that normally when Melanie went out, she would call early the next day to let her parents know that she was okay, and this morning there had been no call. So at 9:15 that morning on the 9th of June, when Melanie's mother heard the loudspeaker calling out the name Melanie, she knew that something was very, very wrong. Jean immediately ran out of the front door and ran into the road after the car and started banging on the boot of the car saying, "Please stop, please stop." When the officer stopped the car and got out and asked Jean what was wrong, she said to him, "We have a daughter named Melanie and she hasn't come home." The police officer could obviously tell that Jean was very, very distressed, so he put her in the back of the police car and drove her back to her house. And this is the moment that Jean describes as the moment that, for her family, all hell broke loose, as the officer told her that a body had been found. Jean actually said later on in an interview that she didn't even need the officer to tell her what had happened because she just had that horrible gut feeling that she already knew. Later that day, the police immediately got started on trying to figure out what had happened. The investigation was called Operation Rhodium, and the police immediately started a thorough investigation of the scene. A DNA sample was actually found on Melanie's body, but since DNA profiling was only in its infancy back in 1984, it really wasn't very useful at the time. The police, however, did of course hold on to the sample in the hopes that one day it might be useful, and they continued their analysis of the scene. One thing that they could tell from the scene was that the attack had actually spanned over a very long period of time. It was very, very drawn out. And the way that they could tell this was that they could see tracks of Melanie's blood starting in one area and then leading kind of down a cul-de-sac where she had tried to get away from her killer. One thing that was very, very useful to the police from this crime scene was that there were actually tracks of somebody else's blood who they assumed was the killer leading away from Melanie's blood in a completely different direction. And the most useful thing about this blood sample was that it was actually from a very, very rare blood type. Only about 3% of the population has this blood type, so they knew that this would make it much easier for them to track down the killer. Back in the police precinct, a separate group of officers were desperately trying to track down the route which Melanie had taken home. She had last been seen at 2 a.m. walking across Pulteney Bridge in Bath, but since CCTV was not really a thing at the time and obviously nobody was carrying phones, it was very, very difficult to figure out what route she had taken after that. To this day, it's actually unknown which exact route Melanie took home, as there were several different ones that she could have taken when she reached nearer her home, as she lived in an area that was lots of kind of winding streets and passageways, so she really could have taken any one of them. Over the next 5 years, the police had no major leads. Hundreds of people were questioned and 94 people were arrested and thought to be linked to the case, but ultimately nobody was charged. At this point, the case came to a bit of a standstill, although it was never completely dropped altogether, and all the evidence was put into a police storage unit in Weston-super-Mare. I find it so crazy to think that it took the police so long to figure out who committed this crime, but we really do just have to remember that DNA profiling just was not a thing back in 1984. Like, I feel sure that if this kind of case happened now, we would be able to track down who did it within like weeks. It would not take very long at all, just because of the DNA resources we have. So literally all that the police had to go on at this point was witness statements, and as we already know, there was nobody around. Like, literally nobody saw or heard anything. So literally for the next 10 years after this crime took place, absolutely nothing happened to forward the investigation until 1995, when the UK's first DNA database came into operation. This was a massive step in the investigation, and it was said to be the biggest breakthrough in fighting crime since fingerprints. The police had held on to Melanie's killer's DNA this whole time in the hopes that exactly this would happen, and his DNA was placed on this database, but no match was found with any known criminal. Again, it was still in its very early days, so nothing really progressed. 5 years later, in the year 2000, a new review on the case was conducted where they looked through the database and tried to find any matches with Melanie's killer's DNA, but nothing was found. Then, almost a decade later, in 2009, a special episode was aired on the 25th anniversary of Melanie's death on the UK primetime TV show Crime Watch, and this episode appealed to anybody who might have any information on Melanie's killer to come forward. As a result of this, 70 names were handed into the police, and all of these were looked into, but again, these led nowhere. During this whole time, Christopher John Hampton had lived on the suburbs of Bristol. He was a self-employed painter and decorator, and everybody who knew him said that he was very quiet, very private. He just kind of kept to himself. He didn't have any criminal record and seemed to be just a very kind of under the radar type of guy. Christopher Hampton met his first wife, Pauline Day, while the two of them were at school, and together they had a daughter named Claire, and this name is very significant, so make sure you remember it. They actually had 2 more children together as well, but they ended up separating after having their 3rd child. When the two split up, Christopher was 32 and he actually moved into an apartment in Broad Street in Bath with a girl that he had just started dating. I think you can tell where this is going. Christopher was indeed living in this apartment during the summer of 1984. Fast forward to after the murder, Christopher moved from Bath to the suburbs of Bristol, which is about 15 miles away, to an area called Fish Ponds. While living in Bristol, he met his second wife, Julie, and the two of them got married and had 2 children named Darren and Amy. Now remember I said that you needed to remember the name Claire? This is the moment where a strange twist in fate meant that Melanie's killer could finally be found after 30 years. In 2014, police were called to a domestic dispute between Claire, who was now in her early 40s, and her boyfriend. It was simply labelled a domestic dispute, but Claire actually ended up breaking her boyfriend's necklace, which is classed as criminal damage, so she was required to give a swab to the police. So the police took this swab from Claire and put it on the DNA database, and little more was really thought of it until 2015, when cold case detectives ran a check on the database. And the last thing that they expected to find was a familial match between Claire's DNA and the DNA of Melanie's killer. Immediately, the police began to check out Claire's family and discovered that her 2 brothers would have been way too young to commit the murder at the time, so that left only Claire's father, Christopher Hampton. Claire willingly gave her father's details to the police, and investigator Gary Mason phoned him up. Christopher willingly agreed to meet with Gary Mason in the car park outside of his work on the 1st of June 2015, and he was said to be remarkably calm and willing to give a DNA swab, considering he knew that he was guilty of murder. 4 weeks later, on July 2nd, 2015, investigators found that Christopher Hampton was indeed a direct DNA match with Melanie Road's killer, and they arrested him at his home on the same day. A forensics team in white boiler suits searched Christopher's house and garden to try to find anything that might link him to Melanie Road, but they found nothing, and Christopher refused to answer any of the police questions. On the 9th of May 2016, when Christopher was brought in front of a court, he pled not guilty to the murder of Melanie Road. However, Christopher shocked the court when he whispered under his breath the word guilty to 1 count of murder. He didn't show a single hint of emotion throughout the entire court proceedings and still has shown no remorse for his actions. Not only had this case gone unsolved for 32 years, leaving Melanie's family and friends unable to move on in any way, but Christopher Hampton had just completely got on with his life, started a family, and even when he was caught, refused to show any sign of remorse. Jean Road, who still lived in the same house that Melanie had been unable to come home to all those years before, described Hampton as a monster who had lived a lie, and she had spent years worrying that she would never live to see the day that her daughter's killer was found. This is technically where this case ends, and although it angers me beyond words that Christopher Hampton was able to go all those years without facing justice for his actions, I'm glad that Melanie's family can now try to move on from what's happened with the knowledge that Christopher will be behind bars for the rest of his life. There is one more thing that I feel is worth mentioning given I've covered this case, and although Christopher Hampton was never actually proven to be linked to this, I do find it a crazy coincidence. 12 years to the day after Melanie Road's murder, a young woman named Melanie Hall was murdered leaving a nightclub in Bath in 1996. Her body was not found for 13 years, although her remains were later discovered in a bin bag by the M5 motorway. It is just purely speculation at this point that Christopher was linked to this. There is absolutely no definitive proof, but I just find it so strange. The situation that Melanie Hall was murdered in being so similar to Melanie Road's. I mean, the fact that they actually have the same name is strange enough in itself, but also that the M5 motorway actually runs to the west of Bristol. So Bristol is kind of in the middle, the M5 is here and Bath is here. So Christopher Hampton basically lived at the time of Melanie Hall's murder in between Bath, the place where she was last seen, and the M5 motorway where her remains were found. To this day, Melanie Hall's murder is actually still unsolved. Nobody knows who did it. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Anyway, that is all I have for you on this case. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to let me know down in the comments. Let me know if you have a particular case that you want me to cover next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.